Unless you're new here, then you saw the front subframe happen. This looks a whole lot like it, except it's all completely different. Mostly. Mostly all of it's different. Anyway, this is a table full of 1 battles from last year, and the only parts that are still rusty on it are the ones that were always subject to change. So now is the time that we change them. Don't worry, GSX and Elantra fans, you'll soon see how finishing this helps get both of those cars rolling, because it does. But if you're just one of those people who likes to see an old crusty thing made brand new again, you're going to love this video. You're going to see a whole lot of the same tools and techniques, but on parts that work totally different. For instance, these stub axles. The front axle doesn't have these at all. Each stub shaft has 8 things stacked up on it if you have ABS. 10 if you count the nut and the washer that hold it all together. Most of it's pressed on in a specific order because none of it's going to stretch over the other parts if you get it wrong. All the press rigging changes a bit, but the way that you use it doesn't. I plan to remove the years of weather and crust from these irreplaceable out of production parts. My Galant came with 4 lug hubs and 3 bolt axle cups. These 5 lug DSM units I picked up last summer came with the 4 bolt cups that let me use beefier axles on my Galant. I just needed the cups. I smashed all the studs and pressed all 4 of them apart anyway because their future potential involves all the things that you're about to see. These hubs have 2 bearings each instead of only 1 like the front axle. These have 5 seals each instead of 2. The outermost seals on both ends of the shaft are just dust shields, and mine happen to be toast. Oddly, one of those seals is sandwiched between the bearing races on an already sealed bearing. It's built into the bearing. You press the inner seal and the bearing out together, and they're an assembly of sorts, sort of like 2 parts to make 1 seal. The reason why I'm swapping axle cups is to install a 4-bolt viscous limited slip rear differential and axles. But I'm staying 4 lug. This is the shaft that I'm going to use, and there's the ABS ring. The groove in the ring faces outwards towards the hub. If you're adding ABS to your all-wheel drive 1G thing, then you need this part, and you can only find them used. There's a 42 stamped on it. It's the last part pressed onto the stub shaft, so it's the first part pressed off. I'm pressing this one apart because I'm going to remove all the rust and fully rebuild these. The bearings are good. They're, actually one of the last bits of service this car ever received, and I helped with this job just enough to screw it up. I bent this particular sealing ring. This was my fault 20 years ago. I even owned the mistakes I made before I was a YouTuber. But I get to make it right. And finally, there's an outer dust seal that's in perfectly good condition because it's only seen a couple thousand miles of use. I didn't bend this one, just the other one, but pressing it off concaves it, and it's never going to line up right where the way it was supposed to, so it's out of here. Fortunately, I'm still able to get these exact replacement parts from Mitsubishi inside the United States, or at least I did. I'm talking about the dust shields and seals anyway, not the bearings. I'll show them to you in just a minute. You can snag those part numbers. Here's the other 4-lug hub and stub shaft that I'll be using, and I'll go over one more time real quick, pressing an ABS-equipped stub shaft apart. First, you've got the ABS sensor ring, and you have to have a bearing splitter for all of this. Next, you press out the inner seal and bearing together as an assembly. If you don't have a mangled edge on your splitter, you can actually salvage this seal by placing it against the outer bearing race. And lastly, you've got this outer dust seal, but here you'll have to flip the bearing splitter over so that the taper side faces up to get in there behind it. It doesn't look quite as new as the driver's side, but it's nowhere close to being bad, and I think I saved it. So now I have 2 pairs of rear stub shafts all broken down to their birthday suits, at least mostly down to them. I just have to smash the rest of the lugs out of these last 2 first, and now there's their birthday suits. And you'll see the trailing arms magically disappear. I'll explain that later. I'm trying to stay on track. After making some room on the table, I'm just going to clean up all these shafts before taping them up to protect them for what's next. I'm using polyester tape because it's the toughest option. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about storage or the processes that are soon going to follow. If you plan to have it apart for any length of time, it's a good idea to do this to protect them anyway. But I'm doing this because I'm about to bead blast the hubs. You don't want to blast any of the splined, threaded, or machined surfaces on these shafts. Of course, I won't be blasting right on them, but like you saw with the steering rack, this green tape will survive it if I did. It didn't take long at all to get the rust off using glass bead media. After blasting, I cleaned them up with compressed air and a rag, of course peeling the tape off of some of the areas that could trap excess blasting media, and I sprayed all the hubs all around with acrylic clear coat to keep them from rusting. Blasted cast iron parts rust even faster than raw cast iron parts do. They often quickly flash rust in humid air in very short order, but not now. It's actually the next day. I let the clear coat dry while using these cups as stands, but before I put these back to a different kind of work, I want to clean out the inside of these dust seals first. My weapon of choice is a fine wire brush on my Dremel. Boy, did that save me a whole lot of time and effort. My diehard audience who watches every single video, I love you guys. They all know Detective Coating did every bit of powder coating that I have so far, and it's truly amazing work. I do actually have powder coating capability in-house, and I've explained before why I chose not to do it. What I would have done my first time would not have been amazing. It would have just been powder coating. But dang it, I had them do 100 pieces for me, and I didn't get to do any of it. I let someone else have all the fun. So at this stage of the game, I'm going to go ahead and powder coat these cups to give them the forever coating and to prove that I wasn't just making excuses and finding reasons to take the easy route out. For instance, you're watching me have to painstakingly mask 2 of the very same small things, not 100 completely different parts of various sizes. But even these things are tedious to mask and prepare. I'm determined to do a good job, even if this is my first attempt at powder coating, and masking fine detail work like this with polyester tape, it isn't really doable, even when you burnish it down and into shape. It still doesn't stick. So for this area, I cheated and used the non-heat resistant masking tape that's more workable than the fine details, and accepting that it's going to leave some residue on my part after it's baked. I'm just using a Harbor Freight powder coat gun to load the coating media onto the parts in a thick but even coat. Use a light and get close-ups all around your work before baking it. Put your eyes on it to make sure you got it all. Once you feel like you did, it's just like a frozen pizza. You bake it at 400 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 minutes, which for you is like 10 seconds. Be careful, it's hot. And these parts will stay hot for a while. The trick with peeling the tape is wait 15 minutes for the parts to drop a couple hundred degrees first before then starting an edge with an X-Acto knife and peeling it while it's hot. Not only does the polyester tape come off easier while it's hot, the masking tape tends to leave less residue. At room temperature, baked masking tape is gooey, slimy, and sticky, so get to it before it does that. For the rest of this one's preparation, I lightly sanded the inside lip of the dust seal to make it perfectly smooth, then soaked that dust seal in WD-40 and buffed it out with paper towels until they came out clean. I finished all this before they even made it back to room temperature, including this close-up where there's evidence that my work met my expectations, if not exceeded them slightly, but it's still nowhere near as rich, black, and shiny as the finish of the parts the detective prepared for me. And in the end, these are just axle cups that nobody's going to see anyway. But I had fun. Beyond the threads and the splines, there are multiple stepped machine surfaces on each stub shaft that serve as placeholders for the dust seal, the outer bearing, ABS sensor ring, and the inner bearing. You can see all the steps on the shaft. You can see where the shiny parts meet the dull forged parts where it's not machined, where the inner and outer bearings are pressed on, and the big obvious steps at the hub were for the outer seals. I've done nothing more than a solvent cleansing because I wish to disturb none of that. I want all my parts to fit the way they're supposed to. These are in good shape, but they certainly have some character. They're never going to look like they were freshly minted on the inside, but everything else you can see does, and I think both of these rear hubs and stub shafts cleaned up nicely. You saw the bearings in the inner seals, but I was still waiting for the dust shield and outer seals to arrive. For you, that only took 1 second, but they finally did, and with no delay, as you can tell, not at all. I started stacking these things back together with brand new parts for their next life. Starting with the dust shield. Notice these are blue zinc now instead of yellow zinc. Not sure when that changed, but I'll go with it because I like new. I had few things around that were cylindrical and meant for the kind of use that you're observing, so I was gentle with a plastic hammer on the wrong tool, trying to avoid damaging my tool more than I was worried about the seal. But I got it, and here's the outer seal, and this part's weird. Presses onto the second step of the shaft, but it's grooved to receive that seal that's on the bearing. Really, the obvious way to tell which way the seal goes is to ensure the inner lips of both of them are facing upward, and installed evenly with the top of each step. We'll look closer at that in a second. I struggled with this one for a bit too. Once again, nothing that fit it very well either in my specialty tools, in my scrap pile, or even bushing press kit. There's a $60 specialty tool made for this, and it's currently still available new, but I don't have it. I'll definitely get it after this experience, but I still got it on there. I'll go ahead and knock these other two seals out in the other shaft before worrying about the bearings. You'll notice that I took a much more aggressive approach installing this one using a punch after I got it started, but it's a brass punch against a steel seal, and the seal's always going to win that match. It's okay if you drive the dust seal as far as it goes, which isn't even a millimeter below the step, but making the inner lip flush with the step is what you're going for here. The orientation of the dust seal is far less critical than the outer sealing ring is, because the outer sealing ring needs to mate with the sealed bearing. Both have to be flat, flush, and fit at the correct distance in order to prevent premature failure of the rubber seal. But once again, you're just going for even with the step. If you get that part right, the rest will sort itself out and you'll have a nice quiet bearing. I really need to buy that tool because it takes all the concentration and skill right out of the equation. It installs it straight every time. And there's the other shaft. Despite my lack of preparedness and my ham-fistedness with a punchy disposition, I still nailed it. This didn't save me $60 because I'm buying that tool anyway. Next on deck is the sealed outer bearing. After you've got your bearing out and unwrapped, you can see this aftermarket Timken bearing has the correct seal on it. Some of them don't. That faces down into the groove, and it looks like stuff from the bushing press kit works just fine in this case. It fits. We got to take this one over to the press. This is going to need a good smashing, but we've already done the hard part. Everything gets easier from here on out. Mash the bearing down until it stops. That's why the shaft is stepped. Smooth. Feels pretty good, but I didn't lube the rubber seal edge like I meant to. Between that and the cold grease, I'll wait and compare it to the other one before I form an opinion of how well I did. Still have this other one to do, but this time I remember to grease the rubber sealing surface first. Same process otherwise. And now with that one out of the way, I need to mash the ABS ring down just like we did with the bearing. Remember, the grooved side goes out toward the wheel. Mash it until it stops. There you go, fully assembled stub shaft with brand new bearings and seals. One last ABS sensor ring to go, groove down, mashy smashy. There you go, 2 stub shafts fully rebuilt with brand new bearings and seals. I told you there were 2 bearings on each stub shaft, but the inner bearings get pressed inside the rear trailing arms. This is their home, freshly remodeled in the postmodern style. Time to get these suckers moved in. Like on the front knuckles, the first thing I like to do is use a thin coat of anti-seize, so if the bearings ever become unruly, either now or even decades down the road, they'll be really easy to evict. These are my trailing arms after all. I'm just nice enough to let the bearings live here, and I don't want any trouble, I just like to be prepared. The press is the right tool for the bearings. The service manual illustrates someone beating on it with yet another out-of-production tool, but I don't really like that. I rigged up the press with the parts of the bushing press kit that fit the outer race, placed the trailing arm on a flat steel plate, and mashed the bearing down on the boss until it stops. When you install the stub shaft, this is the bearing that helps pull the assembly together. This is the side where the axle cup attaches. Now, for the other side, same thing. Super thin coat of anti-seize, brand new bearing, press it into place, and now there's only 2 parts left to complete the entire stub shaft ends of both of these hubs. I'm not going to have to worry about having problems with my rear end for a long time. For the innermost bearing seals, I'm using the SKF seal. I have the Timken equivalents, and they're identical to these, but the SKF boxes were just taking up a little bit more room on my shelf, so they forced me to use it. Once again, nothing in my inventory of tooling perfectly fit the outer edge of these seals, and all I could do was get really close. I tried to use the press, even though the service manual illustrated someone beating on this seal with a hammer, and another out-of-production tool that I've never found. And this time the service manual won. Oh no. 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 I just did it, man. I did it. Tool slipped sideways inside the seal. That's not good. Close doesn't cut it this time. I caught this way later than I wanted to, but I still didn't mangle it. No cracks or creases. Steel's flexible enough with enough force, so I just used the service manual method with the same tool that didn't quite fit perfect to bottom out the seal into the boss. That's the correct way to fit this one. The outer lip of the seal protrudes in just such a way to ensure that even an oblivious technician is going to pound on it a little harder trying to fully seat it. So there you have it. That's the trailing arm side of preparation for rebuilding your axles. That's all there is to it. Clean, fresh, all new parts going in here, and the ones that I can't replace are all refreshed. I did notice that one of the shafts has one half of one thread that was a little bit off, and I tried a few different nuts to make sure I was really seeing what I saw, but I don't have any dies or chases that fit anything this big. Thread files are a super handy kind of thing for stuff like this, and I have 2 of them that came with my thread repair kit. All you have to do with these is get the side of the file that matches the pitch of your threads, and you can use it to clean up any high spots that are interfering with your nuts. The inner dust seal is built into the cups. It could be pressed off, but there's no replacement part or part number available in any of Mitsubishi's documentation for it. It's only included with the cup, and there are no axle cups available for sale anywhere. They don't come with new axles. So don't even bother pressing these apart. We've got rebuilt stub shafts, 4-bolt cups, rebuilt brakes, and refurbished trailing arms, but the first thing we need to install before assembly are these brake dust shields.
This isn't rust pitting, those are hammer marks. Remember, I had to straighten all of this back out. Did a pretty good job. It's not perfect, but by golly, we got ourselves some brake dust shields, and these are hard to find today.
I'm glad I have them, and that I remembered that they go on prior to installing the hubs, but I might as well press in all those wheel studs that I painstakingly restored. I totally didn't simply find a deal on 25 OEM Mitsubishi studs and yellow zinc for $35 plus shipping and take the easy way out. Nope. To install these, I'm just going to use that 5/8 inch nut from the steering rack video as a spacer, and a lug nut with my impact wrench to honk them down extra tight and seat the splines of these new, fully restored factory lug nuts into the hub. You want to use a big nut spacer thing for this rather than the wheel, because you can irreversibly damage your alloys doing this. So what if you destroy a lug nut or a 50-cent nut from the hardware store, or even both? My wheel just thanked me, and I heard it loud and clear because it's right here next to my feet. It wanted to help, but just not with that. These are 33-year-old parts with 150,000 miles on them, if you can believe that. Nobody knows this better than I do, and I sort of still don't believe it. You're not supposed to be able to do this these days, but I don't listen. Let's put those brake dust shields on. It's just 2 tiny little M6 bolts for each one, and oddly there's no torque specs in the manual for it. This is the only one they omitted the spec for, and it's not critical at all that it's right, it's just that they hold the dust shield on, so I gave them all 10 pounds. I've just got to say this while I blast these rear rotors. The dust collector and the glass bead media were a great investment. This thing just cleaned up a whole brake rotor in only 2 cycles of the compressor instead of 6. The last time I did this for the front rotors, I used aluminum oxide, and that was totally the wrong media for it. These brake rotors cleaned up every bit as good as the front ones did, just a whole lot faster. I'm still wearing a half-mask respirator, but now you see there's no clouds of dust flying around me anymore. If you have this blasting cabinet, buy that $40 5-gallon bucket dust collector thing. The cabinet is incomplete without it. You see that random Lancer OZ rally wheel sitting there? I asked it if it wanted to help me install the hubs into the trailing arms, and it was all like, "Yeah man, I've been waiting in here for almost a year hoping you'd ask." This wheel is taking the place of a special tool that's included in a $300 axle puller kit. And since the trailing arms are not on the car, I don't really need it at all. The free method is to put a brake rotor in there, install a couple of lug nuts, and bolt the hub to the wheel. Then lay it down and install the trailing arm. You don't even need a press to seat these 2 bearings. You observed that I greased it well, and that helps. All you do is install the cup, washer, and a brand new nut. The wheel and tire will hold the hub shaft still while you torque the nut down. Now these parts are married. You don't have to send me a gift, just hit the like button. Let's put some brakes on it. Starting with the rotor we just cleaned up, grab that caliper, and I thought again about installing them on the wrong sides. The number of people who commented about that really helped my channel, thank you. Sometimes it's the little things that make a huge difference. Again with the copper anti-seize. Install the clips, install the pads, try to close it back up again, and then discover something's not right. When you rebuild calipers, you need to have the grooves in the caliper vertical, or else you'll have a hard time putting it back together once pads are installed. There's a pin in the pad that centers into that groove. The piston's free floating, sort of. There's plenty of resistance with the dry seal in it, but you can slowly rotate it back into position using a pair of channel locks and not hurt it. And now, another one. Yes, a Galant has 2 of these, and they're mirror opposites of each other dimensionally, as they should be. Otherwise you'd be restoring a motorcycle. I had all the same problems on this side as the other, which was none. And it's because all the hard work of this job, rebuilding the axle shafts, finding and replacing all those parts in the right order and tolerances prior to this moment. This is assembly. You need to let go of your hard work here, put a nut on it, run it down and torque it to 116 to 159 foot-pounds. It's designed to seat itself correctly into the part if you did everything else correctly. Everything's brand new on the inside right now. It's in 0-mile fashion, and you leave it alone until it breaks. Have a happy life in there, bud. I used most all the wrong tools because it's 2024 and I still had not been able to find most of them in the used market until this moment, right now in my life's timeline. I'm not joking. Now, after 11 years since I started looking for them, collecting stock parts to do all this work, looking for those tools with saved searches and still nothing. Now that I just finished the job, that's when they surfaced. We'll look at those later because we got plenty of other progress to make. It hurt too, not the price, I just mean the order of events. I also picked up another one of those stupid $7 brake tools because I hated using channel locks to rotate the brake cylinders. But I don't know where mine went. I've bought like 4 of those things, they just grow legs. New pads, new guide clips, new copper anti-seize, it's clocked right, and I still can't get it to... Okay, it's slightly protruding and it's easy enough to fix. Scared me there. I was like, why doesn't it fit? There, rebuilt brakes with refinished rotors and loaded calipers. Trailing arms, axles, bearings, seals, studs. This means 3 parts groups combine here into one assembly, and they're getting kind of close to complete, but no, we're not. There's still plenty more to do. We've got toe links, we've got end links, ball joints to install, arms, differentials, sway bar. And so for a rear subframe video, you should be really disappointed with me right now, because I haven't even touched the K-member aside from moving it out of the way. If that's you, keep being disappointed because this rear differential isn't going into that subframe looking like this. You know I can't do that. First I'm going to pop the axles out, and I don't know this one's history. Based on the outside of it, I'm not expecting a whole lot from it, but it's supposed to be a limited slip unit. The label's worn off that would have helped me identify it better. It's very rusty. In fact, I've never seen an aluminum rust before. There's rust all over it. This thing just sat here making a gear oil stain on the concrete floor for almost a year since I got it. So what I do know about it is that it needs all new seals, sealant, and plugs for starters, but if it needs more than that, I still have a plan. My first impression after popping the diff cover off is it smells like gear oil, kind of distinct and unavoidable for anyone doing this work. Those that have can probably smell this in your imaginations from all the way across the internet. Nothing's burnt or blackened in here, I don't see any strange debris of any kind, and I don't see any weird marks or even shiny spots in the ring gear, so it's not likely to have any thrust issues. This is all encouraging. Seems like it's just ugly. If you know what Berkable 2+2 gum cutter smells like, then you can imagine this smell too. I'm not using this to clean everything. Predominantly, I just want to degrease it for what comes next. I told you that there's rust on it, or embedded in it at least. Get all the loose stuff off of there. You don't want to put oily, greasy things in your blasting cabinet if you want your blasting media to last. You also don't want blasting media inside any of these parts that are oiled because it sticks and stays. Then it becomes part of a slurry once it's in use and ends up exactly where you don't want it. So the lesson here is, you don't want it. Polyester tape only works well for this whenever you have plenty of flat flange surface, which the rear cover does. I'm using glass bead media, and I'm using it because of its fast cutting characteristics and smooth texture that it leaves behind. We'll get a better look at that in a minute, but one of many cool shipments just arrived, and it's the one that I'm the absolute most excited about. This right here is every part and more to rebuild the rear axles and differential of a first generation style rear end. It's from Amiyama in Japan. All factory parts are Japanese spec aftermarket replacements like these boots. I've got all new seals for the pinion shaft and the side gears. Brand new nuts, washers, and bolts for the 4-bolt cups. New vents, new fill and drain plugs with copper washers. New pinion yoke nut. And brand new captive washer nuts for the end links so that every single service part used in this assembly is brand spanking new when I'm done. But the creme de la creme as far as I'm concerned is all brand new bearings for a 4-bolt rear end. I hope I got my information correct because I believe the part numbers I looked up came from the Galant. Not the 92 to 94 GSX that the differential that I'm using came from, but they're supposed to be the same on the inside. Only the axles are supposed to be different. The differentials are supposed to be interchangeable in these cases, but my plan is to use it if I need it, and I now have it, so I can tear into this thing with impunity. It's a worthwhile distraction there. Now where were we? Oh yeah, so I've got a bead blasted diff cover with most all the ugly stuff knocked off of it. The rust layer's gone, looks like a fresh casting except for where the mustache bar is supposed to bolt up. I left the vent on there, but I taped it up to seal it real good. You just saw the new one that's going to be installed. The only thing I'm going to do beyond what you've seen is work this thing over end to end with the steel wire wheel on my Dremel, all in the same direction. This is a poor man's polishing job because it definitely makes cast aluminum bling, but it's not actually polishing it. This leaves a texture, and it's why it's important to keep the grain straight and do this all in the same direction, or else it will look stupid. I don't want to polish anything on this car, so don't start, won't be none. I really like what I'm seeing here. This looks great. So what about the rest of it? Since I have every important thing that I could destroy in here, let's rip this differential out and see what we've got to work with. 4 14mm bolts secure the diff carriers, and they don't put up much of a fight. Those come out pretty easily. But the differential is wedged pretty tightly into the case. I don't have a case spreader, and the service manual doesn't even suggest using one, but you don't want to pry on it with anything metal. So you'll see me sacrificing wood and rubber hammer handles, which the service manual actually does say to do. Kiss that wooden handle goodbye before you start. I couldn't get it to move at all the way the manual illustrated. I had better luck alternating sides, giving that crumbling handle blows of encouragement from a rubber mallet. It worked, but it took me exactly 27 minutes to get it out. The pinion shaft is easy enough to get out of the case if you have 167 psi of air pressure and a half-inch impact. The electric half-inch impact in the background was no accident here. The pinion shaft has tapered roller bearings on it, so it's easiest to just use a plastic mallet to smack it out. Don't do this over a hard or abrasive surface. Of course, the bearing race is still in there, but I need to take this out before cleaning up the case. The pinion shaft seal turned out to be good and rusted in there. I didn't want to budge. They make better tools than this for pulling seals, but I usually have pretty good luck with a screwdriver. Sometimes I have to turn the misuse of tools up to like 11 or 12 and beat on it and distort the part enough to convince it to cooperate. Impunity, remember? I've got new seals. And there's the inner race for the pinion shaft. When you knock that thing out, it leaves this behind. Now the case is empty enough to clean up. And it's well saturated with gear oil too, so as filthy as this one was, I figured the best place to start was a screwdriver and solvents. Scrape as much away as I can first. After a little 2+2 on the worst stuff, I washed it all out with mineral spirits because that's also a fantastic, low-hassle degreaser. Everything else that's left behind after this will soon discover its fate because I'm putting it in the blasting cabinet. I found some hobby jar lids that perfectly press fit inside the side gear seal bosses and put the drain plug back in it. My solution for sealing up the yoke end was inferior though. It made it about halfway through, and the second I saw it separating, I pulled it out, cleaned it out real good, and found a substitute to take its place. It perfectly squeezed down in there. But this is only the third of at least 5 cleaning stages. We're at almost the halfway point on this thing. I checked my work a few times and made sure I got everything nice and even down to the cast layer. All this took hours to do so I could let the compressor rest, but 40 seconds is enough video, don't you think? You get it. But all that time I spent hovering over this thing left me not wanting to be the one to coat it for a host of different reasons. And you can see that I figured out that the anise bottle was a perfect fit for the yoke. Hey, it worked. Now, here goes the 4th cleaning stage, again with the 2+2 and compressed air. It just needs to get degassed and coated. It looks mint, but it needs coating, and we're going to come back to this one because while that all happens, I've got plenty of other stuff to work on. In fact, there's things I have to do before I can even do the thing. This toe link is perfectly fine, but the end of the sleeve bushing on this other one broke off. It's its only flaw. These are perfect otherwise. So I just cleaned it up real good and used some emblem and trim adhesive to stick it back down because this stuff will glue plastic to metal. These are pressed into each trailing arm, and there's supposed to be a sleeve and a bolt that go through here too, but glue takes time to harden, so I'll set these aside for now. There's nothing wrong with my ball joints except 2 boots are cracked open and 2 are about to be at any second. There's a slot between the ends of the snap ring where you can easily pry the boots off. I have a flat-nosed pliers here, and that's the best I could come up with to get these dang eyeless snap rings out. The chisel's pretty handy too once you get it started. I just used a 30mm socket and a ring from the ball joint press kit to match the joint out of the arm on the hydraulic press. There's the factory ball joint, and it's just pressed into the stamped steel arm secured with a snap ring. The hole wiped clean with a rag. Wow, that's cool. I've got a new ball joint and the snap ring, but I miss the old factory look. I'm always going to miss that. But I do have the original Miller ball joint tool, which is really handy. Just think of this as a fancy, expensive, huge socket that has no hex cut into it because you could do the exact same thing with an appropriately sized socket. It solves the simplest of problems, which I barely even have. Now, to install the snap ring, and there's your brand new 0-mile ball joint. Nothing to this except to do it 3 more times. Look, here's one of the cracked ones. The rubber's soft on one side, but it's cracked halfway around the other. There's like a 1 molecule thick layer of rubber holding all the grease in, and that's the only reason I'm replacing these otherwise perfectly good old joints. Just because I can't get the boot. I know, you get it. The boot problem. I got this idea from J Spec Ruts on YouTube. I was hung up on my boot problem and he was describing how all the ball joints on Galants were the same, so I just bought new joints with boots instead. Big shout out to you, Connor. You helped me, bro. Our Galant projects just happen to be running parallel to each other right now, so if all you watching can't get enough Galant VR-4 restoration content here, please pop over to J Spec Ruts and tell him Jaffro sent you. His priorities are straight, his energy and work ethic are stellar, he's really getting a lot done on his Galant. I love seeing people restoring these old 1990s pre-internet era legends and solving modern problems while they're doing it. That's both of the rear uppers. Now let's do the lower arms. Boot, snap ring, and believe it or not, regular old snap ring pliers also work to take these eyeless units off, sometimes better than the flat nose janks. Press it out with a big socket. It's going to fall out before it bottoms out. Just make sure whether you're pressing the joint in or out that you're doing it around the outside. Be careful after cleaning up and inserting your ball joint not to tear the boot, because you very easily can when you're pressing it in. I know. Ask me how I know. I need the comments. You can prevent this with some creative boot massaging, tape, grease, or just taking your time and lining it all up first. And sometimes you put that snap ring on so well that you barely have to accelerate the video. 3 down, 4 to go, and I know this seems repetitive. We'll speed this last one up a bit. The ball joints cost $40 plus shipping, and replacing all 4 also lets me continue bolting all brand new things onto the trailing arms with all the other brand new things. I would even replace the toe link bushings if they weren't already in perfect condition due to being previously replaced. Again, with the snap ring. Practice makes perfect, I guess. That really didn't take very long, and it's nowhere near as difficult for me as waiting for glue to dry. So for me this is a little bit difficult and I need a distraction. What we're going to do next has been trolling in nearly every shot for the past 4 minutes if you recognized it. Foreshadowing, yep. Abe let me borrow his 7-degree ream for the rear trailing arms that I probably should have brought with me back when we fixed the front knuckles in Abe's shop. It was asserted in my comments for the last video that I had used this tool backwards, and I assure you I didn't. You can see how the flutes are cut. This one goes clockwise. Oh, and you had to put your finger in it. No matter how old you get, again with it. Just, bro, come on, get on with it, man. Anyway, I needed this thing again because there's 4 more tapered holes that I want to clean out on the rear trailing arms before we insert 4 brand new ball joints into them. The goal here isn't to make a larger hole, it's just to get it perfectly round again with no soft material between the ball joint and the hole. The entire hole isn't tapered, so I'm not going to try to make it shiny from one end to the other. My goal is just to knock down all the high spots in either the powder coating or the casting, just to ensure that there's no slop possible in that fit. I don't care if the low spots are filled with powder coat, and as long as the hole is round, and as long as it is, the stud on the ball joint's going to lock itself into center from tension once the nut's torqued down anyway. And speaking of fit, the rear strut mounts got coated. This wouldn't be a problem for shocks that have a rubber bushing in them, but my strut bushings are sleeved, and that sort of causes a thing for me. So for a thing-free assembly, I'm going to go ahead and knock that down. Because this is what happens if there's a thing. I guess I should have showed you this part first instead. That's no fun. This is illustrating why I'm putting a car back together again that hasn't been to paint yet. You find every single one of these kinds of problems first before you paint it. You make it all fit the way you want it before that happens. That way when you blow it apart and put it back together for the final time, you get to go ahead and enjoy it. There's nothing to fix. These trailing arms are incomplete without end links, and that glue's had about enough time to dry, and then a little extra. So to install these, the service manual says to use soapy water. And I'm going to go a step further and show you another trick to make that even easier. First you put the end links in the freezer. Let them sit in there for at least an hour. Use that time to do other stuff like extract the one bolt you forgot to take out that got coated in there, and clean up all your bolt holes so you don't struggle under the car later putting it together. Prep your bolts for the toe links kind of thing. Do all the stuff that pays your efforts forward so it's just ready to go. Go get a cup of water and a bottle of dish soap ready. Right before your hour's up, hit the nice shiny ends of your cleaned up trailing arms real good with a heat gun. Get them hot. Don't worry about the powder coating or the paint with the heat gun on high. If you keep that gun moving, heat the whole thing evenly, it's never going to melt or burn anything. So Get it good and hot though, then go get your first toe link out of the freezer and work fast.
That happened so fast you didn't even see it.
Fail faster, I guess. I missed that shot. Get the hole for the one that you're about to install really hot. Next, take a drop of soap on your fingertips against that really hot part and give all 4 sides that contact the bushing a nice smear. It hurts a little bit, but in a good way. The service manual shows a weakling using a brush. Dip the rubber bushing in a half-full cup of water, shove the steel sleeve back through it, orient the joint so that it leans outward towards the wheel side, not inward towards the differential side, and then give it the 3 bears with a rubber mallet. That's when the first time you drive it way too deep. Then you drive it back out and get it too shallow. Now listen for it. That's the one, perfect, so satisfying. You'll recognize the bolts for these easily because they're the ones that have a little short half-height head on them. Non-locking nut but with a lock washer. They're a perfect fit for the trailing arm with the sleeves inside the toe link. That locks everything into place once they're torqued properly. This right here is what I meant about the toe links leaning down towards the wheel side or towards the outside of the car. The links have a couple of degrees of offset where they protrude from the bushing, and they'll totally let you put them in backwards. But they're like this because the same part fits on either side, so there is no right or left. Here it's only right and wrong. And it's not a fun lesson to learn the hard way at all unless you learn it while the trailing arms are still hot, the toe links are still collecting condensation or frost, and the thing is still soapy wet. But put the thermal trick in your pocket for another rainy day. That trick can also help you installing gears, pulleys, bearings, all kinds of other stuff. You'll notice the only thing I used a torque wrench on so far was 1 pair of bolts that didn't even have a specification. Alright, fine, we'll break out the big torque wrench for the stub shaft nuts. I know I told you the torque spec while running these nuts down with a breaker bar, and that probably irritated a few people's brain cells. These nuts are awfully difficult to get to once the axles are bolted up to them, so I might as well just do it now to be on the safe side. But everything else I'm going to go back over again once it's on the car. I'm installing both of these trailing arms separate from the subframe because of their weight, and because I'm not using a lift to do any of it. It's a much easier balancing act without them, and I'm much less likely to damage the brake dust shields. I will, however, be installing the differential into the subframe first because the bolts that secure it can be difficult to access too, so I need to inspect it, clean it, put it all back in the case, and then check it before installing it. At first glance, I couldn't find anything wrong with it. On this second glance, I wanted to give you some close-ups of the flawless bearing races. All the bearing preload is set either by shims or by the torque load of the nut on the pinion shaft. The side gear bearings use shims wedged into the case to take all the slop out and create that preload laterally between the axles. But yeah, nothing gritty, not one pit, scratch, mark, or anything. Heck, this one's still got a rainbow of sorts reflecting off of it. This is about as good of a part as you'd hope to pull out of a box new these days, so these are going right back in there. The pinion height and the shim size could need to be modified if I replaced any of these. You saw earlier the teeth are all completely wear-free on this one, so I just need that housing to come back. I guess in the meantime I could clean up the yoke flange. All I'm doing with this is scrubbing it with a wire wheel. I'm not clear coating it or anything else. I want my yoke flange to be clean metal on metal against that drive shaft flange. I guess I could put the subframe back together in the meantime, which I have everything to do. After all, this is the subframe video. I've been building hub assemblies, brakes, rotors, ball joints, toe links. It's about time I did something with this thing, right? Nah, we've got to put that on hold because the rear diff case is back, and it's beautiful. Finished in fresh steel gray forever. My brain thought the color combinations would look good together under my car, but my brain currently can't believe what my eyes are telling it. The rear diff cover was refinished in prismatic aluminum, and now I can't start, so there won't be none. The gloss black with these colors are amazing. Once again, new or better than new. What good was all this new hardware if I didn't do this to it, right? My axle boot kits just got here at the exact same time too, and
No.
I thought when I opened the other boots that they looked a little bit small for the outside of a 4-bolt axle, and it turns out that they actually were, because they were for a 3-bolt Galant.
Oh, okay. Alright, well, it's not all bad.
So these boots that I just ordered will still fit better on the 4-bolt axle, because they're the right boot for that, but that's not the reason why I ordered these 2 boots on a slow intercontinental horse. It's as if my errors keep reminding me that all these are rear axle parts, and that this is supposed to be the rear subframe video. Obviously, I'm really stubborn. I'm sorry.
4 bolt outers, 3 bolt outers, and the one I need anyway is an inner. I'm an idiot.
So let's assemble this subframe, I guess. The rear lower arms are the only ones that don't bolt to the subframe using an eccentric bolt. So those are really easy to sort. You just put the nut and the washer towards the back side of the subframe and that's all there is to it. But they get lots of other pieces of flair bolted to them. They get sway bar end links for one thing and some fancy new poly bushings coming soon. But they also get secured on the sway bar end by these fancy captive washer nuts. Kind of a very specific part. New. So let's put this other arm on and take a look at those bushings. They look completely different from the factory ones, so what if you powder coated your old brackets? They're not going to fit. It comes with a collection of end link bushings that you need this time and washers that you'll either not need or you will need. You will need the washers you need to actually fit your part. Because here we've got a stock end link and the hole, no go, too small. Gotta make a bigger hole. Matt had a fancy new tool, so we used it. Still kitting it out and finding attachments like the center drill thingy. I mean, I have the drill bit that's like 2 feet away from me right now, but there's other tools that would work to do this on this thing too. You have to admit, this is so much cooler than a drill press. But with that sorted and the washers now fitting the end links, I can go ahead and install the sway bar. You want to grease these everywhere between where metal and the bushings come together. So you grease the sway bar and the bracket sides. I used cap screws on the brackets because the slotted holes were so tight up against the bracket housing that I couldn't turn a standard bolt head all the way down. I had to forego the lock washer due to the slotted hole in the bracket and its size as well. But all this felt like the logical and right way to solve these issues. So with the sway bar attached and the washers now fitting correctly, now we can stack the bushings up and install those sway bar end links. I stack them with the big washers on the outside of the flat sides of the bushings and the protruding lip sides of the bushings facing together, sandwiching into the lower arm. The hole in the lower arm is bigger than the bolt. It's actually smaller than the bushing, but with enough torque in the lock nut, the protruding lip sides, which are slightly larger, crushed together inside that hole. The rest of the crushed bushing will then rest against the flat surface around that hole. If you can't easily attach the sway bar, raise or lower the arm while bending the sway bar and you'll get it. You won't hurt anything, it's made to bend. There. Now, the subframe's at the beginning of its assembly, and it demonstrates both some rigidity and flexibility now. Always hold the end link in place with a wrench whenever you're installing or removing them, or else you might damage their boots. You can see the bushings smashing down into their holes in this shot. I have no idea what the torque spec should be, so I just honk these down until the bushings are bottomed out good and squished. All the other arms on a 1G subframe are attached with these eccentric bolt assemblies, consisting of the bolt, a guide washer, a lock washer, and a standard nut. These are all brand new factory Mitsubishi parts. If you can't tell by now, I've spared no expense here. The subframe has a mark, and you orient this with the hole up. Don't be concerned with the degrees yet, you'll do that on the car. The guide washer goes on the opposite side, flattest edge facing in, and you secure it with the lock washer and then the nut. We're going to do it again, not because I don't trust you with that information, it's only because the car has another one on the other side. There's no need to add trailing arm assemblies for 3 reasons right now. 1 is because they're heavy. 2 is because the rear lower arms will provide the rigidity necessary for however you'll brace the subframe assembly once you install it. 3 is because everything you need to bolt the heavy trailing arm assemblies onto the car with is easily accessible from the wheel well. So you'll just make everything else you do underneath the car that much harder on yourself. This thing's seen some stuff. It's had a rough 2 weeks. Seems appropriate to clean out these bolt holes after all of this. Thread repair kit, thread repair kit, thread repair kit. It's just really nice when you're under the car and everything is fitting. If you work on things, thread repair kit. They rarely get the credit they deserve except for right here on Jaffermobile. I'm their biggest fan. There's plenty of other rear subframe parts that haven't seen the light of day yet, except through their stretch wrapping, and it's long overdue for them to join their friends in this video, because this is their video. They wanted to be fashionably late. They've been hanging out with this guy named Mustache Bar. He gets bolted to the diff through the holes in the cover that I just cleaned up, and I've got a few more tricks coming. Since I deleted all-wheel steering and the bolts get torqued last, I'm actually done assembling the subframe. This is a subframe video after all, and now this is a subframe assembly. The trailing arms are the most complicated parts of this by far, and I'm installing this assembly in 3 pieces, so I'm done with this for now.
If you ever need to get this waterproof silicone grease off of here after you're done installing poly bushings, WD-40 and a microfiber polishing cloth does it every time.
Do not use red shop rags, paper towels, or even cotton cloths on powder coating, or else you'll leave swirl scratches in the finish, especially when it's glossy. The reason why all this stuff is included in a subframe video, because if you're going to rebuild your whole subframe in your all-wheel drive DSM thing, you have to touch every last thing that you just saw. But the reason why this illustration is such a mess is because it's 4 different parts groups coming together. There's just no tidy way to do this one. There's all your part numbers for everything I used and more to completely rebuild everything on a working all-wheel drive DSM subframe. Because if your car is at the point where it's the subframe that needs work, then you need all of this right here. Some people will remind me that a Galant isn't a DSM, and they're right, but this is all identical. There's a few things missing like boots and brake pads, but we're going to make this one a megasode and go ahead and complete the entire subframe rebuild, all 4 parts groups in a single video. I'm completely stuck waiting for parts right now and I missed my February upload, so I'm going to put some extra meat in this video to make it up to you for that one. But seriously, Galant VR-4 or first generation all-wheel drive, all the exact same parts go in the exact same places the exact same way. The same trailing arm links, whether you have all-wheel steering or not, same axle seals and bearings, same bungs, same bung holes, same differential and yoke seals. Jafro's 1G DSM videos are never in an actual DSM body for some odd reason. There was some damage from the glass bead seal breaking loose that I caused, and I wanted to clean that up. I just used 320 grit sandpaper to make it look like what it should really look like. After the wash and scrubbing, I felt a few specks of something with my fingernail on the races that got baked on, so I used some 600 grit wet paper very lightly and it practically wiped off, leaving behind the same exact smooth polished surface that I had before. Once it passed my inspection, I washed it all back out again and dried it. Time to clean all the bits of my hammer handle out of these old differential parts. I'm not taking it apart because of the condition I found everything else in. For me to make a rear diff rebuild video, I need a reason, and this one didn't give me one. I'm just cleaning this thing and putting it back together with the rust gone and all new seals. Since I'm not changing any of the bearings or shims, I should be able to get it all to line right back up again, and we'll find out. I'm using Lucas oil to lube the bearings because it's really sticky. It's hard to get it to flow in there, but it offers enough protection until it's filled up with the right stuff. Once happy with the bearing lube on the inner pinion bearing, I installed it back into the diff housing, then installed the spacer and the outer pinion bearing. Next I got an old pinion nut, one that had already been stretched out before because it's a lock nut. No point in using a new one for this. Anyway, I ran the outer bearing as far down as I could by hand before taking the yoke back off and lubing up the outer bearing. If you don't snug it in there real good before you do this, the pinion shaft could fall out while you're trying to lube up the outer bearing. That would be bad. My specialty tools started to trickle in, and here we have the axle shaft seal installer tool and handle that I didn't have earlier when I needed it. This isn't actually the right tool for this, it just also happens to be a perfect fit for driving in the pinion shaft seal, because the outermost ring on it fits the part of the seal and the seal boss flush. So it's going to do the thing. I'm using it wrong, but at least you get to see it. You can tell how that tube would have been really handy on the press with an axle shaft. This is just a drop in the bucket for what I found. Now I'm going to set the bearing. I haven't realized this yet because for whatever reason I'm opening up a brand new nut, but you should use an old one for this. Grab your 27mm socket, your 1/2 inch air impact, and run the nut down until it stops. Give it an extra blip, turn it a bit, and then take it right back off again. This squeezes everything in the sandwich and sets all the bearings in place without putting any wear and tear on your new lock nut. Be sure to grease or oil the inside of the pinion flange seal. It's really called the companion flange, but I insist on having a business-only relationship with it. I also use the impact to run the brand new lock down most of the way because it's stubborn. This time I bought the right yoke holder. At least I thought I did. It looks like the thing, but for whatever reason it showed up with a big 10mm studs on the end, and I sure could have used a banana for scale on this one, but determined to get my money's worth out of it and still using it incorrectly for its intended purpose, I grabbed 2 bolts, put them through the yoke, and wedged the heavy-duty handle of this tool between them so that I could counteract the load of my torque wrench. I set the torque wrench for 150 pounds, but the spec is 116 to 159 foot-pounds. Next, I'm installing the differential. Lubing the bearings. This is not the lube the service manual says to use, this is my choice. I maintained the order of this stack of differentials, bearings, and shims from the second it was removed. The service manual says to put your fingers in the ends and set/drop the assembly into place, then alternate sides driving it in with a brass punch and a hammer. You can tell by my hammer selection I'm being overly cautious here, but if you don't have a brass punch in your toolbox, get one at least like this. At the very least, get this. It's an important tool. Notice that I'm centering both on the bearing and the shim, but mostly the shim. You want to keep them both aligned together while you're doing this. Not difficult. The hardest part is doing all this without bolting the case down to something. I don't have the jig that holds on to it. That would be nice. Next up, we've got the carrier bearing caps, and I rotated it with the bottom towards me so that I could put them back on the same sides I removed them from. Lettering outwards towards the wheels. Both cam caps and their 4 14mm bolts get hand snug into place for now. I know it's foolish to do this right now because if I screw up any of my tests, then these seals are going to be in the way of me fixing whatever's wrong. But I'm anxious to use this. This thing right here is the Mitsubishi OEM service tool to install differential seals. It lets you take your brand new Mitsubishi differential seal out of its package, perfectly and flawlessly fit the outer lip of the axle seal down into that detent to center itself. You see that lip I'm talking about? There's a whole collection of different drivers like this for installing seals on these cars, and we have always used sockets, but I wanted you to see the things that are in the illustrations in the service manual. They're real, they do exist. I'm so glad to have this. On this side we get to have some more fun. How about a new factory magnetic drain plug and copper washer? Excellent. And one more axle seal to do. There's something you're supposed to do before installing a seal, and there's a penguin joke in there somewhere, except, what you're supposed to do is spit on it first. We'll get ice cream later. I'll let gravity and physics do most of the work here for me. The diff carrier bolts get 40 foot-pounds, and I can easily hold this thing still by laying it down, and to get the leverage I need to avoid rolling it off the workbench, I just stabbed one of the axles into it. And that did the trick. See, that jig would have been really nice to have right here. But 40 pounds is all they get. It's plenty. Since I made everything else shiny and nice, I might as well do the same thing to my differential cover bolts, or the opposite anyway, give it all a little bit of contrast. It's nice to visit my home garage. Welcome back, everybody. Anyway, it didn't take me very long to clean them up, but you already know what I'm going to give these. The Caswell Black Oxide treatment, that's right, to match everything else that isn't brand new. In case you think I'm sponsored, I'm not. This is still the same kit I bought 2 years ago. You could use this acid bottle as a measurement tool and mix it all up in a single batch with 9 parts of water, but it's much more economical to buy some cheap plastic graduated cylinders and measure out smaller batches. I'm doing 500 milliliters of distilled water to 60 milliliters of acid, and as a result I've had enough to do every single engine bay bolt, subframe bolt, and more. Easily enough to do a whole car out of just one kit. At 2 years old, it works just like it did when I first bought it. Getting all the bolts plated again would always be the best option, but for the theme of this build, I chose black oxide. I sanded the diff cover flange flat, washed my freshly finished sanded part out real good with mineral spirits, ensuring to backflush the breather port. Dried it with compressed air, and then cleaned out all the bolt holes real good with a steel wire brush to open them back up again. All I want is for my bolts to fit. And when you look at that, that's going to look awesome together. I can't wait to put it back on there, but let's make it even better. Brand new factory fill plug and crush washer to keep the other stuff company. But I didn't like the hole, had to redo the hole there. Now, new factory fill plug. I've got a grayscale rear differential now with some zero maintenance bling, and I didn't polish anything. I got to check out the backlash, run out, and pinion height. Backlash is the play between the pinion gear and the ring gear where it meshes. It's normal to hear this after you reassemble it. That's normal, but you need to know how much of it there is, and we're all about to find out. But I'm cleaning up the gears because I want to check my pinion height first. Doing that's going to tell me if I stacked everything back into the correct order or not. To check pinion height, you use paint or marking dye on the gears. You create some wear and you read where the pinion lines up in that wear. I'm going to use Dykem. There's nothing wrong with Prussian blue. That's all 100% me. That's my fault. Just like how some people get antices everywhere, but I never do. Whenever I open this stuff, 3 minutes later, it's on everything I own. Everything in my shop is blue. Dykem sucks if you let it dry, so let's go ahead and do that. The factory service manual actually says to jam a brass punch in between the case and the ring gear flange on the differential to create the resistance and load on the ring gear while you're turning the pinion. And I thought that was crazy, but okay, for the sake of time, we'll see what that does, aside from making me chase it all over my workbench. When the marking die dries, it takes a good amount of pressure to rub it off, and the faces of the gears should be butter smooth. This is where gear marking paint works a whole lot better. Reading the gears is an art form. What you're looking for is the polished spot where the gears meshed against each other in both directions. You really want that in the dead center, but there's a shape to the pattern, which is a fat edge and a shallow edge. You can see a light spotted or buffed shape dead center, a shape almost like that of a mammalian protuberance on all of the gear faces in the exact same spot on every tooth. I know this die is harder to read, sorry. You want that mark in the center. Same thing goes on the back. In fact, you can see the contact spot where it isn't coated with the dye. That's interesting. I think that's the previous wear mark from before I bought it used and did all this to it. And all the marks I'm making right here are lining up with that. So it looks to me like I kept everything in the right order and did it all correctly from this test. Now let's measure backlash. You set up the dial indicator off the face of the gear and it's easy. All you have to do is push the ring gear to one side, zero it, push it to the other, and read how many thousandths of an inch it moved. And I've got 6. The manual says to measure in at least 4 different places, so I just cheated and moved the camera zoom back to make it look like I was in a different place. It's fine. When I cut the scenes, they'll never notice. I really don't care if this one's out of spec somewhere else. Someone else put miles on it. As far as I'm concerned, it's proven. It's a 4-bolt. You see that, don't you? I'm chuffed because I like it set up loose. In spec, at the end of spec, is exactly where I want this one to be, and that's precisely where it is. Measure yours in at least 4 different places. I'm going to go ahead and move on to check run out. Here you just measure off the back edge of the ring gear. Turn it, watch your high and low needle movements, and if it exceeds 0.02 of an inch, you have a problem. I've only got about a 0.5 thousandth. This thing is mint. I cannot ask for better than this result right now, not from a used part that looked as rough as this one did. Thank you, Performance Part Out, for my shot at rebuilding this old ugly duckling. This is going to make this Galant the best Frankenstein ever. But now that I have that splendid rear end, it's time to rebuild a pair of beefy 4-bolt axles to go with it. They're every bit as ugly as the differential was, but I'm about to change absolutely everything about that and give them back their factory fresh appearance again. Only thing wrong with these is the corrosion and one punctured boot. Finally, I got all my boots. I need to do a whole lot more to these axles before I get to use them though. Once you get the clips off, and all you need for these factory clamps is a tiny sharp flathead screwdriver, the boot's the only thing left holding the inner CV joint on. Wipe away the grease and you'll find a snap ring. That's what secures the inner bearings to the shaft, and sometimes it just slides right off. Once it's out of the way, now you have the room to slide the boots off. The outer joint's a whole different deal. There's no easy way to get to the snap ring, and some people say just smack the thing off with a hammer. The way the snap ring works, sometimes you'll beat on it all day long and possibly even damage the joint and it won't come off. Do it this way. Go to your press, put the axle in your bearing splitter with its dangly bit doing its dangly bit straight down, and with both hands, lift and milk it real hard. Pops right out first try every time because it keeps the snap ring flat and level in its groove rather than favoring the side of the joint that you're beating on from with a hammer. You know, there's the trick if you ever gave up on it before. I've still got one more axle to take apart, and you have to keep the parts from each side separated because they're different. After your snap ring flies across the room, sometimes the bearing cage just slides right off, but sometimes it needs a few light taps to get it going. We'll do that outer joint trick one more time. Set the axle down in the splitter, both hands. It's by far the easiest way that I've ever found to separate outer joints that are held on by an inaccessible circlip. I gave the shaft a chemical bath, a good wire brushing, a pass on the wire wheel to grind away all of the surface rust, another chemical bath with a powerful solvent, and then a masking job to protect it to almost to the point where the boot clamps down for its fresh coat of gloss black chassis paint. While that dried, I worked on cleaning up and degreasing the inner and outer CV joints. One of the outer joint's seal bosses had some non-optimal pitting on it, but it wasn't where the seal made contact, it was just outside of it. But I still don't like that, so I spent a lot of effort cleaning that back up again with 320 grit sandpaper. I can't make it perfect, but I definitely made it 100 times better than it was. After I was happy with it, I masked it up and immediately ran out of camera batteries. The Galant manual says not to take this apart, but these axles were from an Eclipse, so that's my loophole for getting away with it, getting around that. This is just a miniature lowbrow joint after all, so I'm not scared. I decided to do this because I was unsuccessful removing the old wrong coagulated grease out of this with just mineral spirits. And there's 7 different warnings against that in the service manual saying not to mix this grease with the correct unspecified axle grease. It's the same exact stuff that's in the low bro joint, and that I also use in the steering rack, but these boot kits all came with the right stuff and the measured amount. I'm going to use the stuff that came with the boots. A lot of people don't, but anyway, I just needed the old grease gone. After protecting the insides and all the exterior machine surfaces that I could with poly tape, I used a ripped off old piece of inner axle seal that I found inside my 4-bolt cups to protect the mating surface, and I taped it down real good with electrical tape to make it stay put. Because like many other things, this is all going inside the blasting cabinet. These axle joints cleaned up 10 times faster than the brakes did. I actually had this shot focused when it began, and if you think this looks blurry, then this looks exactly the way it looks to me whenever things are this close to my face. Just saying. After bead blasting, I give them a compressed air bath, a chemical bath with scrubbing both inside and out, and another air bath prior to paint. I painstakingly ordered a $40 can of spray paint that's supposed to be industrial Mitsubishi green. The picture on the internet looked right enough for me to give it a shot and wait for it. Wait for it to wrap up its United States tour. Its shipping itinerary was hilarious, but anyway, this says that it's called Jewel Green. Look, it also says forklift on it. I gave the joints in the outer portion of the seal several thin coats of it with multiple angles, multiple different times, and my first impression is I hope that this darkens as it dries, but I'll save you all that video. Next, I peel off the masking job from the shaft and prep it for assembly. The boots go on first. Depending on what style of clamps you're using, sometimes it's helpful to put those on first too, but these style aren't so picky. You can install them either way. Outer joint needs balls. Install the first pair on opposite sides from one another. Install the first 2 one at a time. And now you have a pivot point for making installing the other ones easier. Sometimes you get lucky and you can put 2 on one side at once and then do 2 on the other, but it gets harder and harder to move the more balls you put in it, so sometimes it's only going to let you do 1 at a time. Why do you always have to be in such a hurry anyway? Brass punch and light taps are your friends here. I also have to clean the wrong grease out of the inner joint as well. This one's got 3 captive needle roller bearings, and these definitely you don't want to take apart. You can feel if the bearings are bad with your fingertips, but with the old grease out of the way, now it's time to start putting the shaft back together. Boot's already there. There's a step on the inside of the splines, and that side goes on the shaft first. When it's fully seated, you'll see the snap ring groove on the other side. Give it its snap ring. Replace it if necessary. Most boot kits will come with a new one. I wanted to press the dust seal back onto the CV joint while the paint was still fresh and tacky. The stub axle service tube was perfect for this job again. Gently drive that one down until it stops and then check it to make sure it's true and on plane. Next, I polish it with the steel wire wheel Dremel thing to extend the life of my axle seal. This actually does contact the differential seal, and you should grease this part down inside the groove that I'm cleaning with paint out of right now with an even finer wire wheel. Right, so let's assemble this thing. Starting with the outer joint grease. Manual says to put half of it in the joint, half of it in the boot. I'm going to have to say no, my damies. I'm putting all of it in the joint, all of it. I cut a small 1/2-inch hole in the bag, jam it into the hole and squeeze it all in there until it starts running out the sides. Then I put the leftovers in the hole too. Next, take the axle shaft and be cognizant of the circlip position. Get the splines to line up and press it down into the hole. Keep pressure on it, not too much, because with your other hand and your small, sharp, flat screwdriver that you needed for your boots, you need to work your way around pressing that circlip back in. Just use the force. You know it's there. You can't see it through all the grease, but it's there. If you don't keep pressure on the axle, it's just going to pop right back out. But once you got it seated, pull the boot down and get it situated, then hammer the other end of the shaft through the joint until it fully seats. You'll both feel and hear it. Give her a couple good bumps just to be sure. That ain't going nowhere. Now, go over the boot again. Make sure it's fully seated on both ends and right in the groove. The clamps you sometimes have to fight with to get tight because there's no consistency between one brand and the other, There's 3 claws on this one that grab into the perforations on the strap, and you pull those and fasten them in just as tight as you can get them. The position of the crimp portion matters only because at this point you shouldn't be able to rotate it at all without taking it loose again. Next, take the worst pair of crimpers you ever purchased cheap on Amazon and crush the crimp as best you can with those to fully tighten the clamp around the boot. I hammer mine flat. Some people don't. There's another spot you should also hammer flat, this protruding edge of the strap near the hooks. I can't tell you how many times I've cut myself working on other people's cars because of this, but it was at least once. I remember one of them real good. I think hammering these flat makes a cleaner, safer installation. Man, I had to flip, turn, twist these things in efforts to keep the clamp straight, and it crushed into a trapezoid. You know, these pliers are total junk. I'll do better. But for the inner joint, this is the easy one, really. We already snap-ringed the groove, and this one's the one that's only held together by the boot. All you have to do is grease the bearings first. The outer bearing race can slide back and forth on the needle bearings without falling off. Grease both sides of that gap, working that grease into the roller bearing. Spin it, slide it, twist it, bop it. Then go full ham on the grease again and dump the entire thing into the cup. Line up the boot on the joint first. You'll figure it out when you look at it. This boot is weird. And then jam it down into the joint through the grease until it bottoms out. Get your boot all situated and straight. The only thing holding it all together now is the grease, so be gentle while you're doing all of this. Then get everything crimped and aligned. Again, I do the hammer thing. These things don't just potentially injure you, they also pick up every plastic bag you run over if you don't. Boots and bags are a terrible combo. I've said it before, in both of these cases you can always make the situation either better or worse for yourself, and I think my viewers care about these kind of details. The direction you put the clamps on even matters for this, so just don't take my advice on brakes. I'll put calipers on the wrong sides all day long though. This is why I hated what the manual said about the brass punch against the ring gear flange for resistance thing. I know the metallurgical differences in hardness between these materials, and I knew it was going to deposit itself all over my fresh, clean, but still partially inked hardened steel differential. In some places it left chunks, and I didn't want that, but I also understand that brass flakes inside the case won't hurt any of these hardened gears, especially not under the loads they endure, and it won't interfere with its operation. I mean, I get why they say to do that, but that method of resistance will leave pecker tracks. I'm happy with it though, so I'm going to seal it up using this Mitsubishi RTV sealant. Mitsu Bond, Honda Bond, same thing. This is actually parts group section 10100. This one item is that whole section. I cut the cone to the number 2 step and squashed the bead dead center of the flange all the way around it, surrounding all the bolt holes. It's not illustrated like this in the manual, it's barely illustrated, but it appears as if they may be suggesting it should be spread thin first. Again, I'm going to have to say no, not for the tippy tie. That's how you make a mess. Once you got it looking like this, it's flat on flat. These flanges are flat. It will squash itself flat and spread itself evenly across the entire flange. I just bolt it down in a star pattern all the way around slowly by hand and then torque it to spec, which I'm hitting right in the range here at 27 foot-pounds. I work my way around in the same star pattern, slowly creeping up to spec. I spent less than a minute cleaning up that tiny amount of excess sealant that you saw squish out, but before I know it, memory card full. And now we're installing the diff case vent, because who doesn't like new factory parts? We're not done with the sealant yet. The manual says to spread a thin coat on the bottom of the gasket in the corner here, between the plastic and the gasket. I also need to dig out an appropriately sized socket. Either a 14 or a 15 millimeter should work fine here. And I was hoping to be able to just push this thing in with my hand with a socket because it's plastic, but I wound up needing a hammer after all. Next, there's the mustache bar. I'm going to go ahead and put this thing on. No sense in waiting. Half of the bolts that secure the rear subframe to the chassis are on this differential support, this mustache bar. That means that the differential case itself is a sort of cross member because it connects those two mounts to the rest of the weight of the subframe behind the front 2 bolts on the subframe. So just like with the front subframe, all the bolts need to be the correct bolts, the correct grades, and the correct torque specs. I'm going to functionally Easter egg my subframe with these stainless steel M12 by 125 thread pitch Allen plugs for the 4 holes where my rear steering rack used to be. These are motorcycle mirror plugs, $14. There's never any point in welding shut any holes for something like this, or with bothering to remove that part of this car's character, but I also see no point in leaving bare steel threads open to the elements right on top of the subframe between the tires. To keep moisture and filth from getting in, I'm plugging all these holes. You did see me use RTV on the threads, that did happen. The copper washers seem unnecessary here, but why not? They contain the sealant and they're decorative too. They're shiny. Neat. Nobody's ever going to see these fancy things once the subframe's installed, but I know they're there and they're never going to rust. This is the original 33-year-old subframe this car came with after all. This preserves the holes should any kind of all-wheel steering system ever somehow find its way back in here, but I doubt it. It wouldn't need anything else to support it, I just did it all. Plus now it has beefier axle upgrades and a limited slip differential too. 4 bolts secure the differential to the subframe. There's a tricky insertion, but you'll figure it out. You don't just set it down straight on top of it. All the differential bolts get between 72 and 87 foot-pounds, and 80's right there in the middle, so I'm going with that. I'm torquing all the differential and mustache bar bolts now because they're structural. The front and rear subframe mounts are connected by the differential, and I don't want any wobbliness when it's on the jack or while I'm handling it. Wobbliness. I don't believe I've ever used that derivative in my lifetime. I had to say it again. Sway bar bracket bolts, factory or otherwise, should get 7 to 10 foot-pounds. That's it. With a digital wrench, sneak up on your lower end torque specs such as these. Do it slowly, increasing that torque load, and then hold it at that load. You'll notice that the bolt continues turning very slowly and slightly until it quits. That's a logical place where I stop with the lighter ones. Oh yeah, mustache bar bolts. These will stand out from all the other ones due to their length. These are M12 by 28 by 125, grade 8s, not to be confused with the many exact same sized grade 7s on the front subframe. These are the only 2 grade 8 M12 by 28s on the whole car. All the different grades have different yield strengths and get different torque specs. 8s get between 58 and 72 foot-pounds. I'm going with 65 because once again it's right there in the middle. These are the only bolts that I want to torque right now prior to installing this thing. All the other stuff's getting torqued once it's in the car. This will safely let me put it up against the subframe and get the 4 subframe mount nuts sorted out, and it completes all the hard to reach once it's installed bolts. These are all torqued. Both of the upper subframe mount bushings are in really good shape. I see no need to replace these. Heck, you can even read the factory part numbers right off them still. That one's MB584140. I'll likely revisit all of this, but it's not the last time I'll be installing this assembly. This is just going to get me rolling. There's not very many things left, but the mounts get 6 fasteners. There's a pair of M12 by 25 bolts that secure the front lower subframe mount brackets, and for whatever reason, I put the dang differential yoke bolts in this shot. These are grade 10 M8 by 25s. They don't really go in this scene. They're just sitting here because, like I said, there's not much left. The rear subframe mounts use these rubber-coated bump stop washer things and a pair of 22mm nylon lock nuts. But aside from these 2 bolts that go on the subframe mount brackets, there's also a pair of 19mm flange nuts that I didn't even bother picking up to show you. Come on, Jaffro, get it together. That's all the stuff that I need laid out to put this thing into the car. Well, not all of it. This would be all of it. That right there is what it looks like, but my table's groaning under the weight of all this. It's nice to see what all this looks like together, but we're all just dreaming right now. This is not what we're doing right now, so snap out of it. I'm going to go ahead and grease the differential seals now, just so I don't forget. I'm just using general purpose grease for this. I'm trying to leave a good film layer without leaving globs of grease, because it would have a potential to sling out and make a mess if I overdid it. The car needs some prep work too. I have to clean up all the subframe mounting studs. If you saw the front subframe video, I explained why all these points are so important and why you have to get this part right. You can clearly tell that these are in far better shape than the bolts that were on the front mounts originally, so it's not going to take very much here at all. Just some light wire wheeling and some wiping. For now, it's easier to just bring the wire wheel to the bolts than it is to bring the bolts to the wire wheel. As little as they need, I think it's the right decision, but it's not the only thing that I need to do. There's 4 power steering lines for the deleted rear steering that run down the passenger side of the car. Removing it sure beats refabricating it. Besides the lack of power steering equipment, because I removed it all, the lines have also been cut. Wildlife moving into them. Just got their house out of the way. Sorry I got that all over you. I cleaned up my mess under the car and I installed the rear struts. I need the struts to hang the rear trailing arms from. If you were installing the whole assembly, you'd want to have these hung first. They help. I love having a rolling workbench. I have plenty of other things with wheels that I could move this on, but now I get to stage everything right here next to the car. I'm using a small carpeted moving dolly with some extra lumber just in case the assembly falls off the jack. I situated it so that the jack rises through the center hole and supports the bottom of the differential with a little block of wood. Nearly dropped it once, and at one point I had the whole thing just dangling off the edge of that block of wood, but I got it by myself without incident. Once in place, I quickly secured the rear mounts with their nuts and washers to increase the safety factor. I just used an electric impact to run those down. We'll torque them in a minute. Next, I raised the jack until the front subframe seated in place. I didn't like the edge of that block of wood being the only thing supporting the front half of all this, so I worked pretty fast to get the third mount finished. It's safe enough that it can't fall once that happens. The whole thing probably weighs around 300 pounds when it's fully assembled, and it's a good thing that I started on the other side because I had a whole lot of trouble trying to get this side to cooperate. It took a little while more than I thought, with a thread chaser to try to get through it, and that failed, so installing bolts by hand lets me catch all of these issues where using power tools would not. That's why I put myself through all that punishment when I'm restoring something. So anyway, I got this with a tap, and I sure wish I caught it earlier, but the subframe nuts all get 80 to 94 foot-pounds. I stopped at 80 because I'll be taking these loose a few more times, so I'm not gonna, overdo this. I'm just gonna do the bare minimum for now. No point in making things harder for myself later, damaging fasteners and going for broke, I just don't want any of this being able to slide or shift is all, and the bare minimum is going to do that. The rear subframe's front mount bracket bolts get 51 to 61 foot-pounds. I'm doing the minimum again. 51. With the rear subframe installed, I'm going to hang these trailing arms in place, and I saved a little bit of grease to freshen these things up before these go in for hopefully the last time. I'm not putting the eccentric bolts in yet because the mount will hold it in place while I hook up both the rear arms and the struts and the axles to it. I probably should have installed the axles first, but you can do it either way. The passenger side gets the axle with the long double splines on it. You'd have seen the first one go in better if the memory card didn't end, but the single splined axle goes on the driver's side. Doing the trailing arm, the axle installations laugh, saving more than 100 pounds of weight to juggle and balance on a block of wood on top of the jack. Seriously, these things are not light. Installing them separately makes them a whole lot more manageable. It does come with only one caveat that we'll get to in a minute, but it's really no big deal at all. Most of this is just set in place, but it's all here. Let's fill in the blanks with all the fasteners they need. We'll do the vast majority of what's left in just one stop. This is 8 brand new factory axle bolts, lock washers, and nuts for my freshly rebuilt 4-bolt axles, so that I can bolt them up to the unicorn 4-bolt cups that I searched for years. This is the moment when I became fully content with not restoring my all-wheel steering system. The moment I connected the single best bolt-in factory drivetrain upgrade of a 1G GSX that I could possibly give this Galant, and I just pulled this off with parts that have been discontinued for decades, just like everything else on this Galant for the most part. There's essentially zero wear on everything but the differential, which is clearly seasoned exactly the way I want it. So even though these axles are completely the wrong color green, I'm pumped about how good all this looks. Jewel green's totally for forklift bodies, and I could have come closer in the paint aisle of Walmart, but someone please save me the time and post the correct factory axle paint code. I know you're out there. I'm not the first one to do any of this. So finally, we got the last 2 sets of fasteners to wrap up a monumental and monstrous episode where I completely restore every single part, component, and detail of the entire rear subframe assembly, and in less time than it takes for me to show you how to make your own 4G engine harness. Daggone it, Jaffro, why did you just do that? We were on the last 2 bolts, and you just... Really? Why did you jinx it? Well, it turns out the energy suspension bushings up front came with a sleeve that's totally the wrong size for the bolt that goes in it. I don't have this backwards. These bolts are identical to the ones that just came out. They're just shiny and new ones. It's totally the bushing sleeve. I got myself by never checking this. The inside of the bushing sleeve turns out to be just shy of 12.5 millimeters. The eccentric bolt that goes through this thing's in 14 millimeter or 1390s-ish. Either way, the factory bolt's an M14. I don't care how cold it gets outside, that one's never going to fit, so naturally I grab my set of drill bits to discover it ends at 1/2 inch. Nobody makes a 14.2 millimeter drill bit, but I can get a 14.2876 millimeter drill bit by using a 9/16 inch. I don't want 0.6 of a millimeter of slop on this bolt, 3 is enough. Right now there's negative 1.6. With no on-site ability to make a 9/16 inch hole, my efforts were derailed yet another day. I didn't wait long though, but when it arrived, I gave Matt another reason to use his new center drill attachment. There's no hand drill or drill press that can perform this task as precision as this, and it's a gift to have such helpful neighbors. I try to help out around here however I can, and in the last year I've been here, I've been useful 3 times now. Matt quickly fettled a pair of sleeves that could now fit both the bushings and the eccentric bolts properly. The width of the bushing sleeve is every bit as important as the size of the hole for the bolt. When the nut's torqued, clamping load is applied. These washers squeeze the sleeve in place, not the bushings. The bushing floats on this sleeve. It's important to grease the outside of the sleeve, but greasing the bolt for corrosion resistance is up to you. I'm expecting that I might have to make a few adjustments back here for alignment, so I'll have another opportunity to grease the bolts then. I'm dialing all the eccentric bolts to 0 to establish that alignment from later. I have no idea where they were set, but I changed everything so it doesn't matter anyway. Well, everything with these struts, I only changed how they look. Before I go much further, it's imperative that I bolt these down and torque them correctly for safety reasons, because for everything I have to do next, they're going to be supporting the car's weight, only up on jack stands. It's a balancing act as it is already, so the last thing you want is your strut to pop off its perch while you're underneath it. Only put the parts of your body that you don't need under the car while you're doing this. Take your time to make sure the car is secure. You need the suspension loaded when you torque all your bushings. It's less important with the poly bushing to do it like this, but everything with the rubber bushing has to torque them with the suspension loaded. This is how I do it, and I do it because even with the car lifted a foot off the ground, it's barely enough room to do anything with a tool that's as big as your torque wrench. The first bolts I want to knock out are all the ball joints. 2 of them will let you access them easily with a torque wrench, and 2 of them won't. Not if you don't own a set of crow's foot sockets. But the torque load is 43 to 52 foot-pounds, and I went for 48 where I could, and real good and tight with a wrench wherever I couldn't on the lower arms. Speaking of lower arms, let's almost finish those off. They get between 65 and 80 foot-pounds. I'm going with 73. That's just the goal anyway. Digital torque wrenches love to tell you when you go 3 to 5% over, but I aim for the middle of that torque spec to keep that in check. Right above both of those 2 bolts, there's the upper arm eccentric bolts that are used to adjust the rear camber. Both are 22 millimeters and really hard to access with a torque wrench if you're on the ground. After centering the adjustment at 0, hold it still with one wrench and use the other wrench to apply between 101 to 116 foot-pounds. You'll quickly discover without a lift, there's no room to do this with a half-inch torque wrench. You can't. It's too big. You don't get any swing. You just have to understand that load and apply it with 2 other wrenches. Maybe later I'll do it on a lift. You're squeezing the pin inside the bushing when you do this. You got to remember the principle. You're almost practically fusing these things together so it's good and tight. There are 4 eccentric bolts. They're all the same bolts, and I appreciate that Energy Suspension got the inner diameters of the other 2 bushing sleeves correct. But on all 4 of these eccentric bolts, whether for toe or for camber, like I said, I'm just dialing them all into 0. There's something here I think is going to be a problem. See that thing right there? Yeah. Once that clip comes out, maybe I can do this by hand. Maybe I can get lucky. Hey, look at that. Boom. If I'm lucky, I'll be able to get this out. It's a very tight fit. With the thickness of this powder coating, that cable's never going to fit. This caliper has a secondary mechanical bit inside of it that I can use without the hydraulics, and being cable driven makes it all fairly easy to sort out so long as I can make it all fit correctly. This required cleaning up the cables as well, and I think I did a pretty good job. If I encounter these parts or a set of better, cables in the future, I may replace these, but these work just fine actually. Next up is the toe link bolts. You'll need your 17mm and a lock washer. These bolts are also bushed, and they receive 61 to 80 foot-pounds. I'm going for 71. The passenger side put up nothing resembling a fight, but the driver's side gave me a fit. As I torqued it, the lock washer snagged the nut, spread itself open, destroyed part of the finish itself and the nut. Just took everything out with it. You must have a plan for replacing whatever you destroy. Just make it right. Problem solved. Bolts torqued, and now we've got sway bar end links to deal with. 25 to 33. I'm going with 28. The sway bar side of the link torqued down, no problem. But maybe my noobness with poly end link bushings is getting me here. I couldn't get anywhere near that torque with a poly bushing. I started to crush and distort it around 24 pounds, so I quit. If I did this wrong, I've got a spare set from the front subframe to replace them. But at 24, I'm stopping it. Other side, same deal. Even with easy access to the nut, it's still a pain because you have to hold the other side of the link still with a 12mm wrench the whole time. And the torque wrench is heavy, so count on resetting yourself a lot. But that finally completely wraps up those lower arms. In fact, the only real thing left before we get to put wheels on it are the 8 new axle bolts. Of course, I've got the 3-bolt axles in my drawing, but those bolts get 40 to 47 foot-pounds. I'm going for 44. And wouldn't you know it, I can't get the torque wrench on these without crow's foot sockets either. Some people call them offset sockets. So anyway, I'm chasing 44 foot-pounds on my own, I guess. You could probably hit this with a 1/4-inch chrome Craftsman swivel socket if you wanted to be really particular, but your 1/4-inch torque wrench probably won't go to 44 foot-pounds, and that socket might not like doing that either. These last 8 bolts wrap the complete rebuild and restoration of the entire rear axle section of the service manual, and it put all the best OEM parts of a DSM rear axle into my JDM Galant. The only thing I can come up with based off what I found, from the rusty pump full of water to the cut, rusted out lines, worn out rack, and even the hint of fire damage underneath where the hydraulic leaks all started, I can only surmise that this is an organ that this car always rejected. It's a far better car without it. I secured the e-brake cables, and I'm only a pair of wheels away from giving this one its legs back. This has been a long journey, and it's worth it just to get the room reclaimed from putting it all back in one piece again. My shelves are emptying out, and I love that. But to also have a complete reset finished on both of this car's subframes, the suspension, the differential, axles, hubs, brakes, bushings, boots, bearings, everything foundational and mechanical is practically brand new. Rewind 3 videos and it got a new interior. And now this. Limited slip, dog. Let's get the final shot of the whiteboard before we move on to something completely different. Looks to me like that's the last thing on my list. I've got a bay back now. With wheels on this thing, it can roll. This is how finishing this car helps other projects, and I really needed this. We got a whole lot of work done fast, and I think this is pretty complete. If you're having to restore your all-wheel drive Galant, Eclipse, Talon, or Laser, you're going to need this. Aside from 1 or 2 different rear differential options that have the exact same bearings and seals inside them, you just got either the 3-bolt or the 4-bolt axles and cups to deal with. That's the only difference. Absolutely everything else is the same, and this is how I restored mine. Every single detail about it. I think they look great for their age, and we get to witness a beautiful thing starting off this season this year. A DSM losing its jack stands. Thank you, Patreon, for believing in what I'm doing and for all of this, really. If you learned something or you had a great time, do me a favor and hit that like button. If I left anything out, leave a comment because we all love that. All of us do here. It's why we come here to do a thing together. Thank you for watching and stay tubed.